Hi everybody, this is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and today I'm going to do a combined viewer games and viewer questions show, or as the case is here, viewer game and viewer questions show. Alright, well let's begin with the game. So this is between Reggie Best and Jordan Whistler. Whistler is the one who submitted it, and he had black, so I guess I'll flip the board around since some of you guys like that. I'm kind of used to seeing things from White's perspective, unless I'm playing when I'm reviewing games, but it's not a bad idea to do this flipping around stuff and getting used to looking at it this way. Anyway, let's have a look at the game. So he was kind of curious about some of the key moments, and actually I have kind of an independent set of annotations. So I looked at his very briefly, but have my own thoughts on this. Okay, so here White played knight b to d2, which I think is not maybe the most incisive way to play. So I think castling is more common, and then after f5 you could play knight b to d2, but you can also even play knight to c3, which looks a little bit funny, but you know, I might suggest, okay, it's not the same thing, but you might want to take a look at the recent Kramnik-Nakamura game from Vaikon where Kramnik played knight c3 in a different kind of Dutch, but again allowing the doubled pawns, but in some ways it helped his position. Another move is to play knight e5, threatening queen h5 check, and okay, if knight f6, this is possible, but then what is Black been doing the last couple of moves? And if and if queen h4, then f4, bishop b7, and then d5 seems to throw kind of a dynamic monkey wrench into Black's game, and White might be even better here. Okay, but I don't really want to discuss this. Let's get to the main idea. And you end up with this kind of Bogo Indian type of position. Okay, again, White could castle, but he played a3, takes. And now here, I think probably knight takes d2 is better than bishop takes d2. Now, White might have been kind of frightened off by something like takes, and then the g2 pawn is hanging, but if he takes it here, rook to g1 is fine, and if queen to g5, then rook to g1. Taking is not so advisable, just bishop to f1 or bishop e4, and on queen h4, queen c2, queen h2, and castles, and White has excellent compensation for the pawn. So, bishop takes d2 happened instead. Okay, castles, d6, and now White played queen to e2, and I think White just, excuse me, never really grasped that he should try to keep his bishops. So bishop to e1, and then after knight to d7 to play knight to d2. So you know, it looks a little bit clumsy putting the bishop on e1. It looks kind of ridiculous. But the thing is, the bishop will come back out. And one of the points to bear in mind with having the bishop here is that you don't necessarily need an open board. You just need a position that you can eventually open to the bishop's advantage. So here Black's knights have no permanent outposts in the center, so White pretty well has the position under, you know, under reasonable control, and can play for the long term when the bishops will matter. So f5, f3, and now Black has a couple of moves that I saw in the database: knight to g5 and knight e to f6. When I flipped on the computer to check my analysis afterward, it came up with queen to g5, which I looked at in a few places, but not here. But this is interesting, but White still is better. fe4, queen e3 check, bishop f2, queen d3, and now either rook to c1 or the sly a4, threatening rook to a3. And it looks like Black's best is to give up the queen for a bunch of other stuff. So now queen takes d4 is possible if White takes the rook on f2, so takes, and takes. And Black has a rook, bishop, and pawn. Or smaller pieces, let's say lesser pieces, don't have any obvious way to target White's camp. But okay, it's you know, nothing special for White either, just a small advantage. But anyway, this is, I think, the way to go for White. So you play bishop to e1. So he played queen to e2, knight to d7, rook a to c1 and f5. So Black is going in traditional Queen's Indian, or Bogo Indian if you prefer, fashion, or Dutch. I mean, this kind of approach has been known for many, many decades, at least since early in the 20th century. Okay, again, white doesn't play bishop to e1, but plays bishop to c3. And now, I remember Whistler criticizes himself here for not playing knight takes c3. He even gives this move a question mark and suggests instead that he should play knight d to f6 and then head for g4. I think he's got it kind of backward here. Not that knight d to f6 is bad, but I think knight takes c3 is absolutely appropriate. I don't believe in black's attack, really. And, the thing is, these knights, okay, leaving aside the knight to g4 plan, so assuming that that doesn't really work, black's knights are superfluous. I mean, this one comes here, and all it basically does is serve as an understudy for the knight on e4. So let's just get rid of the extra knight, get rid of white's bishop pair as well, and put the second knight on e4. And that's what happened in the game, and I think it's a completely legitimate way to play, and black is, I think, at least equal there. But let's take a look at knight d to f6. Okay, white could play knight to d2 and insist, I think, and this is fine. Knight c3, rook c3. And now knight to e4. I'm not sure if this is really all that attractive anymore. But white can also get on the right track. So assuming we're speaking objectively here, of course, given that white never played bishop to e1 when he had the chance the past several moves, he probably wouldn't have played it here. But again, let's assume best play, or something close to best play. Okay, well now knight to g4. And first of all, white can just kick the knight with h3, and I'm not sure there are any really compelling sacrifices. Knight to d2 is also possible. And I looked at this and I assumed that this was okay for white. And it is okay for white, but actually black can force kind of an amusing draw. So queen h4 is nothing special, just h3, and again, the retreat's required. And f3 is maybe in the air, and trying to be clever with rook f6 is just a blunder, because when black eventually recaptures with the pawn, the knight on g4 hangs. But knight takes d2, bishop takes d2, and here black has a funny draw. So a la Lasker Bauer, except only a draw this time. Takes, check, takes, and white can play f3 or f4, that's equal to, so might as well just grab it and force the draw. Okay, if black tries to play for win with rook f6, he gets the queen, but white has a rook and two bishops for the queen and two pawns. And if black tries to play for a win here, he's the only one who can get in trouble, I think. So might as well go for the draw here. Okay, so knight d to f6, it's alright. I don't think it's anything special, though, again, because I think h3 is fine, or even knight to d2 and this. So I think he made the right decision. Takes, rook takes, okay. Here black, I think, could try other moves besides knight f6. I don't think it's bad, but maybe queen f6 is better, preparing to play e5, and also c5, just neutralizing the center. This actually, I think, is a good move, and then knight f6 might be more easily played. The reason why knight f6, which is very thematic, may not be so great here is because of a very important trick in the Queen's Indian that black players should know. Well, players with both colors in Queen's Indians ought to know about this idea. And it's d5. So a very standard trick doing two things. So first of all, it's kicking the props out from the f5 pawn, and it's clearing d4 for the knight to come to a great square. And even sometimes when this is a pawn sack, it's pretty good because there's often play along the c file after the exchange. Okay, so for instance, e takes d5, knight to d4, threatening knight e6 as well as the pawn on f5, takes, takes, and now black should play d5 himself, and then this position is just very unclear after knight to e6. So this is kind of murky, but it's not bad for black. It's just, as I said, very, very complicated. But often this d5, knight d4 idea is bad for black. Okay, so rook f to c1 happened, knight e4, black achieved the post-up of the second knight, rook 3 to c2, and here I think c5 is the right move. And he kind of alluded to this and wasn't really sure when to do it, when not to do it. I think this is a good moment for it. Okay, white could play b4, but it's no problem. Black could play either queen f6 and just kind of build up here, or even play knight to g5, although this I think is fairly equal. I mean, both sides are to some extent stymied in their plans. Trying to build up the attack with g5, I think, isn't really such a great idea. White could play first expansion like this, and probably he's okay, but this is a little bit more fun for black. But again, d5 I think is very good. So this clearance idea once again. If e5, see another point of this trick, takes, knight to d2, and okay, the bishop on b7 is kind of stupid. I mean, it can come back to c8 and rejoin play, but the pawn on e4 is loose. The white queen can come to g4 or h5, and this is just better for white. If e takes d5, then again knight to d4, threatening the fork, and if bc, rook c4 is good, hitting this pawn, so we don't give up that second pawn this time for the exchange. So knight e6, and pressure on the c file. White's better here. Okay, so in the game, instead of c5, black played rook to c8. Wonder what he's up to. Here too, though, white should have played d5. Again with the point that, all right, if white takes, then black gets, if black takes, then white gets lots of play with the usual knight d4 stuff. And e5 is again bad because of takes, and knight to d2. And this one's even worse for black because now the rook on c8 prevents the bishop from going to c8 and from there to f5 or other squares. Okay, so white played b4 and black played bishop to a6. So again, I would suggest c5. So you stop the expansion, you keep this bishop on d3 kind of passive. I mean, look, with this pawn on c4, the bishop on d3 doesn't have any real vistas. It just kind of hits the knight on e4 and that's it. And the rooks on the c file have nothing to do either. So it's very logical. We're basically taking away most of white's possible activity in a single shot and grabbing some space. So takes, and you can take either way with the d pawn or the b pawn. Both are fine. Okay, so after bishop to a6, though, once again white has d5. So bishop a6 is a mistake. So d5, and now if e takes d5, cd. Taking on d3 would be a disaster because then every single light square on black's side of the board almost is weak. So bishop to b7. Now knight to d4. So again, typical, just give up the pawn. Bishop to d5, f3. Okay, if c5, then takes, bishop c4. And because of the pin on the c file, white's winning. So up a piece for a couple of pawns, and the c pawn is weak. I mean, black could play c4, but then all of his compensation, all of the fluidity in this position is gone. So that's not really very appealing. And after d5, if he plays e5, then we've seen this idea already a few times. Okay, queen h4, and now g3, followed by taking on e4. And again, white's clearly better. So black has a little bit of play here. This one isn't as bad as some of them, but still, it's nothing approaching full compensation. Okay, so after bishop to a6, here white chose to play bishop takes e4, fe, knight to d2, and now d5. So this version is not anywhere near as good for white as some of the d5 lines where he goes on to take on e4, but he's still a little bit better. Okay, and now here black had to figure out what is he going to do about the threat of c6. So after c6, bishop a8, the bishop more or less no longer exists. I mean, unless black can exert some kind of miraculous rescue where he's able to win the pawn on b5. So Whistler played rook to a8, which makes sense. Okay, he's, the rook on a8 can come into the game by playing a6. The bishop can go to c8 and at some point play e5, and that can come back into the game as well. But probably the best move is just to play c6. So this way we keep the c file neutralized, and we don't have to bury the bishop in the corner or anywhere for that matter. So here black would only be a little bit worse. So after rook to a8, takes and takes. Actually, it's still not so bad. White played rook to c7, and black should have played rook c8. This point Whistler noticed. But he played bishop c8 instead. It's easy to miss tricks like rook to c8. I mean, you get so focused on the bishop being under attack that you might not see it. Okay, well here white missed an opportunity. So just as he missed d5 several times, he missed a good idea here. One thing I'll pick on Mr. Whistler a little bit about is that he was always looking for improvements for his own play, which is absolutely right, but almost never for his opponent. I mean, so you had these annotations which are a little bit strange in that, okay, white's better, and he criticizes this black move and that black move and another black move, and at the end he draws. Well, didn't white do anything wrong? I mean, if black is starting off worse and makes, a number of errors of various degrees of seriousness, and he still draws, surely white did something wrong. So, look for your opponent's improvements too, not just your own. Okay, well anyway, here's one of those moments where you can look for an improvement for white. So here white played queen to g4, which, it's not a bad move. I mean, it's aggressive. He's looking for ways to use this rook on c7, so that's commendable. But even better, I think, is to play f3. So we're just going to get this last piece into the game. So after ef3, I mean, otherwise just losing a pawn, knight f3. Now the knight is in touch with this beautiful square on e5, and once it reaches there, then it's clear, I think, that black is even in more trouble than he was before. You can also play queen f2, queen g3, and maybe play the knight to g5 in some cases. So there are a lot of really nice things that white can do once his knight gets to f3. So queen to g4 happened, and here, okay, instead of so here I think, again, Whistler criticized his play. He played rook f7, suggested queen f6 instead as better, trying to get the queen into play. But I think, as earlier, the move that he played was better than the move he recommended. So after queen f6, f3 again I think is not so fantastic for black. So takes, I mean, maybe doesn't have to take right away, but it's inevitable. Knight f3. And again, I think black's position is awful. So white just needs to make some prophylactic move so he can move the knight, because if he moves the knight right away, then there's queen f2 check, queen f1 check, and rook takes f1 mate. So you just play something like h3 or h4, and then you can move the knight, and or king h1, and after h3 or h4, and black is just completely tied down. So a better move than either rook f7 or queen f6, though, is bishop to d7, with the idea of playing rook to c8 first of all, and if f3, then queen to e7 might actually be good, with the little trick fe4, queen takes on a3, trying to take advantage of some weaknesses that white has in his position. So this is actually kind of an interesting position. So rook takes d7, queen e3, king h1, and I think we can just play g6. Let me see, is this right? Now I'm getting myself slightly confused here. Okay, g6. What if queen h3? Okay, that's not seeming to work. Oh, yeah, sorry. Okay, right. The rook is hanging. Never mind. Yeah, queen takes rook and mating in a couple of moves. All right, that was kind of amusing. Right, I was thinking the rook on c7 is protecting it here, so I kind of switched off and was only focused on the e-pawn. So anyway, rook d7 is impossible, obviously. Sorry about that. And if you can't play f takes e4, though, then black has some time to defend. So you can play the rook to c8 and get rid of that pressure. And the pawn on a3 is always kind of hanging there, and then there's always the queen takes e3 stuff. So black, I think, has gone a long way towards neutralizing white in this position. Okay, so rook to f7. Not a bad idea, but I think not quite as good as bishop d7. Okay, so takes. Again, f3. I think this is best. So we got to get that knight into play. I mean, this knight is the only guy that's not really working. It's not really helping us out here. So the sooner we get that into play, the faster we get black into deep trouble. Okay, so queen f4 check. Queen f6 may also be inaccurate. It's not a bad idea in terms of principle, but I think there's a specific problem. So rook c7, king to g8, and now queen takes f6 I think was a very bad move by white. So this really reduced a lot of his advantage. What he should have done, and for two reasons. So one is that because black is so tied down, more pieces are actually helpful because you can create more threats. Secondly, after g takes f6, now on f3 takes, okay, it's still not bad for white to play like this, but knight f3 does nothing. There's no e5 square anymore. So here, a6, a4, and white has some advantage here, but it's not much, and it's mostly gone compared to what was going on before. So what white should have played here is queen to d6. Black's queen has nothing really to do on the king side, and queen to c6, for example, is a serious threat. So h6, queen c6, and now the only move is queen to d8. And here this is actually an instructive moment too. So you might think in this position to play something like rook takes g7, king g7, and queen takes a8, and you're winning a pawn. But the problem with doing this is that you're really kind of cashing out very, very cheaply. Black plays queen to c7, and sure, white's still better, but black has this counterplay that's completely undeserved. I mean, now black's pieces and pawns are, you know, pretty well coordinated and safe. White's knight is bad, his king's a little bit vulnerable. So this is just, you know, a dream come true practically for black, even though he's still significantly worse. So white should play something like a4, for instance, just kind of squeeze black in the position, or maybe even better, f3. Okay, and again, if e takes f3, knight f3, and the knight joins the fun here, and it's just great. So black should probably play actively with something like a6. Okay, takes, bishop takes, but you know, at least we get to clean up some pawns here. So queen e5, threatening mate on g7. Queen takes d5. Okay, and white's up 2 pawns for really not a whole heck of a lot. So this is definitely satisfactory for white. White's just winning. Okay, so queen f6, serious mistake. gf6, we already talked about f3. a4, yeah, this is another idea I had. So a4, a6. Knight f1 would transpose to a line we can see in a moment in the game. But I tried to make a5 work, so I thought this would be kind of clever. But after ba, b6, rook b8, say king f1, a4, knight to b1, it's interesting, but it's a little bit fishy. I mean, it's very hard for white to make further progress. So, okay, better to try to make further progress with even material than down a pawn and with a passive knight. All right, so in the game, white played knight f1, a6, which is certainly very good. Now, if a4, then takes, e5, say h3, takes, bishop e6. And, all right, white's won a pawn, but, you know, now black's forces all make a lot more sense. And here, okay, I mean, this is just, it gets into pure tactics, but the basic point is, I don't really want to go through this whole line, so it goes for another 7 or 8 moves, but the basic point is that black has gotten himself out of the box. So this is real progress. And I think the biggest culprit was, well, 2 big culprits for white. The queen trade was, let's say, the last error, but white's failure to ever play f3, I think, really hurt him a lot as well. All right, so in the game after a6, white took and played rook c6. Here I think Whistler criticized himself a little bit for bishop takes f1. Yeah, I think bishop c4 is fine too, but I think it's just equal in either case. It's just, you pick your equality, really. So bishop f1 takes. Okay, and now here, one more instructive moment, I think. White should probably have tried g4. And while it's equal, it's maybe a position where white could end up being a little bit better if black isn't so careful. So the point of g4, well, first of all, it avoids an immediate draw that Whistler either missed or didn't bother with. And secondly, it prevents black from playing f5, so it keeps the pawn a little bit weak, and also it creates some squares for the white king to go up to. So with the pawn on g3, it's a little tougher for white's king to go forward. So here it's got a little more breathing room. Okay, so white played rook b6, and here black has an instant draw with rook a1 and rook a2, since it would not at all be in white's best interest to just surrender the king side so he can take on e6. That's not a very good deal. Okay, so black played king f7. Again, white should play g4, but he played g3, f5, and now it's just equal. So both sides are really pretty well tied down here. Okay, yes, no reason to really pursue some of the sidelines, so this is just a draw. Not a poorly played game, but there were a couple of key ideas that both sides missed. More white than black. I mean, black, I think, black should have played c5 earlier at a number of spots, and then he would have had a very solid position on the queen side. So instead, he gave up lots of ground, and then white, for his part, didn't really see a way to cash in on his advantage. And really, the key thing was, he had a nice position, and he tried to win without using all of his pieces. So just like the motto for attacking play, to invite everyone to the party, it's true really in all of chess. So whenever, unless you just have some win or some clear gain with the pieces you've got already active in the position, you should try to get everybody active. And if you do that, then the chances of you're finding that decisive breakthrough will go up. Okay, so that was our game for this week, and now let's turn to a couple of questions that were asked. Okay, so someone, I think it was King Hunter. Let me see. Yeah, I didn't write it down, but I think it was King Hunter asked about this variation of the winnower. So in this position, instead of the current most popular moves, which are knight c6 and f5, what about the move c4? So he asked why this went out of business and what white should do about it. And he continues a few more moves. So bishop to h6, knight g6, takes, and bishop e3. So why is this line not so popular for black, and what should white do about it? Well, I would say the reason it's not very popular for black is that black has no counterplay in the position. So by playing c4 so early, and he's done a number of things I think are not really promising for his position. So he can't really use the f-file because white can just play knight e2 and knight to g3, or play queen h3 and g4. So rook f5 is not really going to happen. White, for his part, has a very, very easy plan. White's just going to run the h-pawn up, open up some lines, and attack. And black has no counterplay on the f-file. His pieces are all kind of locked away from the king side by nature of the pawn structure. And on the queen side, he's got no real threats either. I mean, queen a5, white could play king to d2 or knight to e2, and what then? So it's just a very easy position for white to play, and one where black has to suffer. So I'll show you some games. And okay, this is the other thing that I wanted to say. In which you can file under the heading. You can give a man a fish, but it's better if you teach him how to fish. I know it's not how the saying goes exactly, but that's the idea of it. So just as he saw that this isn't so popular by kind of looking through the games, well, look at the games to see also why it's not played. So try to find games played by high-rated players, and see what kinds of things happened. So I just looked at my list in my database with the games that reached this position, and I kept seeing over and over again not just a lot of 1-0s, but a lot of h4, h5s. And so here are some examples featuring high-rated players where you see the same thing over and over again. All right, so first of all, from Groningen in 1987, we have a game between Van der Wiel, strong Dutch grandmaster, and first player named Van Heste. So this is, a little bit of a rating mismatch. Black was 23-25, but still you get to see the plan. So h4, here we go. Okay, knight c6. Black wants to bring the knight to e7 and maybe to f5. No problem. h5, takes. Knight e7. knight f3. And actually, van der Wiel had this position twice. So first, the Van Hest game. Black played queen g6, no problem. Rook g5, queen h3. Okay, black got his knight to f5. As we'll see, van der Wiel is not impressed. So he just castles. Takes. Okay, probably the capture is not such a great idea. g6. Okay, rook h1. Rook g4. Rook h4. It's just easy. He's opening them up like a tin can. g4, and it's over. You know, if he takes, then rook h8 check, or knight. Yeah, I mean rook h8 is strong. Or you can even just play queen g4, knight g5, and then triple on the file again. So black tried to run, and he gave up. So that was it. Game over already. His king is bad. The h pawn is strong. It's just awful. Okay, going back to this position. Now we see van der Wiel picking on someone his own size, Robert Hübner. Great player. Very strong German grandmaster. Several times a candidate. And he still gets destroyed in this game. Okay, so bishop to g5, knight g6, castles, h6. Well, rook d to h1. So he's definitely not impressed by this. He's going to take on h6 next. So Hübner took, knight g5. And, okay, the threat's just a triple now for white on the h-file and play rook h8, and then take knight takes h8, queen or rook takes, and it's going to be mate. So rook f2, queen h3, king f8's forced, queen e3, so now he's hitting the rook, and he's got rook to h8 check. So rook f7, and here he decided even better was just to take, rook f1. Okay, now if king e7, then queen g5, I think, or rook h7, both look pretty strong. Maybe both of them, queen g5, king d7, rook h7. So king g8, rook h to h1, he's going to play queen h3. And black gave up here. So 26 moves, and one of the strongest players in the world was just destroyed. Okay, so that's queen e8. Alright, bishop to d7 has been played a few times. Alright, so h4. And now there's a correspondence game that went in rook f5, knight e2. And I'll just kind of go through some moves quickly here. And the idea is to play queen e3 and take the pawn on g5. And black is losing material, so he decided eventually to sack the exchange. But white eventually won anyway. So again, we see a position where black has no counterplay, and he didn't get mated, but lost material, and took a while for white to win, but it was just a matter of working it out. Black had just nothing to do but sit and suffer and hope, and it didn't work. Okay, another game. Instead of rook f5, black played rook f7. h5, once again. Takes, g6, queen h3. Knight f3, so he's just going to play the knight to g5. Okay, black stops it, and white just plays g4. Very simple. Takes, and okay, white went on to win, just kept attacking. So if queen takes, then queen h7, queen h8, and rook h7 is mate. And white just builds. Okay, now the threat maybe is to play queen g6, rook h8, rook 1 to h7, rook takes queen, and then rook takes rook. So black plays rook to b7, so the rook takes rook part doesn't work. Just to illustrate this, let's make some random move here like a5. Okay, takes, check here. Second one does this and wins. Alright, so rook to b7, rook takes, queen g6, takes. Okay, if queen f2, the king just goes to c1, no problem, and b2 if necessary. So he took, check, and he's losing the queen, and then he's losing the bishop too, so he resigned. This was Bartlomiej Machia against Klimenko, played in St. Petersburg in 1996. Machia is now a strong grandmaster, maybe he was just an IM at the time, and Klimenko was about 100 points lower rated. Okay. So we've looked at some queen e8 games. We've looked at a couple of bishop d7 games. All right, now queen e7. This is a game played between Kacyan, who's a GM, and a player named Furman. Not Simeon Furman, the old Soviet grandmaster, but Leo Furman, I think, who's a master that I've actually gotten to play. I played him once in Las Vegas a couple of years ago. So same result, but my path wasn't as easy as this one. All right, so h4, queen f7, h5, once again, queen f5, queen e2, takes, queen g6, rook g5, rook g3. So, all right, a little tacking here and forward and backward, but at the end of the day, white still has an attack and black still has his lousy position. King h8, knight h3. So the knight's going to come to g5, sometimes to f4. Bishop d7, king d2. So we're going to bring the rook to h1. Bishop a4. Okay, and now we don't want to allow queen to g6 or queen f5 with some pressure against c2. So he just cuts it out with queen to g4. So queen f5 gets mated in 1 on g7, and queen g6 is losing a key pawn. So knight c6, knight f4. And now he doesn't even get to lose the key pawn. He just gets killed. All right, you can see, white's attacking with his entire army here. So every single piece he's got is involved in the attack. And again, just because of the way the pawn structure is, black has a very difficult time having any defenders help out. So rook to g8, and here he resigned because after rook to g8, knight f6 is destruction, utter destruction. Okay, so that I hope answers your question and is a sufficient demonstration of why this variation is not very popular. Okay, next question I received was about opposite color bishops and fortresses. So rather than give a full lecture about it, maybe I'll do that at some point, but instead I'll just show kind of a classic example, which I think is a nice way of highlighting how this whole fortress thing works, and in a pretty dramatic fashion. Okay, white's obviously worse here. He's down a couple of pawns. Black has this huge mass on the king side, and white's c-pawn isn't dangerous. So black's idea, black to move would just play king to c7, king d6, king e5, f5, king f6, e5, e4, king e5, and just slowly but surely move forward, push white back, and win. So white has to do something to prevent this plan from happening. What does he do? So see if you can figure it out. Okay, the answer, and I think the only answer, because once black's king gets to d6, it's over. So the right move is c5, with the point that after bishop takes c5, we have bishop to b3. And black's king can't protect the pawn yet, so e5 is good as forced. And now white plays bishop e6 and king e4. And this is just a dead draw. There's absolutely nothing that black can do. White is just going to play bishop f5, bishop g4, bishop f5, bishop g4, bishop f5, bishop g4, forever. Okay, and he can make those two moves, and there is not a thing that black can do to stop it, not a thing black can do to punish it. Okay, he can do absolutely anything he wants to that's legal on the chessboard, and those two moves can be played forever. And it's a draw. There's just nothing that can be done. So here we see a perfect example of a fortress. And the basic point is, with all of black's pawns on the same color as his own bishop, they can be blockaded. And that's just what white has done. So white has an airtight blockade. Everything's defended. There aren't any gaps in it. And the black king is also equally powerless to fight for those key light squares. So this is certainly a kind of an idealized demonstration of a blockade, but, well, that's the danger. That's what makes opposite color bishop endings have that drawish tendency. So they're by no means automatic draws, but they have this tendency. So that's the danger with them. That's what you have to be careful about. Okay. Finally, from Bystanders, he asks about this. He says, in chess openings, there are the so-called sidelines, main lines, and main lines. People talk about them a lot, but I don't understand exactly what determines which lines get to be the sidelines, main lines, and main lines. I thought that the main lines were supposed to contain the very best moves discovered up to that date, but in some cases these lines do not seem to be any better than the lesser main lines. For example, the poison pawn Sicilian, or even sidelines. Why is this? Also, who decides these things, and how are the decisions made? Do they debate indefinitely until everybody agrees? Most people agree, or what? Lastly, where do you go to get the most up-to-date information on which lines are main lines and sides? Thanks. Okay, well, I'm inclined to respond in part kind of, jocularly and say that, well, there's this committee of people, and, first they were in the former Yugoslavia, and now they're in Russia, and, they hammer these things out and they decide. But, that would, of course, be a joke. No, I mean, what makes something a main line is just that that's what everybody's playing. So, the majority of the people play. So a main line is simply whatever seems to be the most critical continuation at a given moment. And this can switch. And, there can be multiple main lines. So, a sideline, I would say, I mean, think about it this way. The way chess theory works is not that you have, some smoke-filled room with a bunch of, balding middle-aged guys debating, okay, what's going to be the main line this week? Well, if you give me $500, I'll make this one the main line. And then all the English book publishing companies can get rich. Well, actually, maybe they do have such smoke-filled room in the UK, so that way, Palliser and his buddies can put out a new book every week on whatever the hot opening is. But seriously, I mean, what happens is just you have certain openings that are, or certain opening variations that people get interested in, and there's a whole series of problems that need to be solved in them, and people just try to work it out. And, if it gets worked out very easily, then it becomes a sideline because, okay, we know how to solve this problem, or at least, we being, the grandmasters who have looked at this, we know how to solve this problem, so it's not interesting to us, so let's move on to something else. And again, it's not that they have a conference and say this, except in the kind of sense in which a chess tournament is a conference. So you can think of it like they're presenting their papers. So, okay, I've got my ideas. I've got some clever variation or some clever move or new idea prepared in this variation. And, if it just wins, then, well, the move that the opponent played will rapidly become a sideline unless it gets repaired. And anyway, that's just how it goes. So, a sideline, let's take something like the Ponziani, which I've ridiculed a little bit recently in an earlier show. Why is this a sideline? Well, it's because Black knows how to solve the problems that this creates. Now, if so there's a new book on it. Now, if it turns out that some titled players, like the ideas in this book, and it starts getting played more, and it turns out that there really isn't any very simple way for Black to just neutralize White's idea, well, the Ponziani could become a main line, or even a main line. But if, at best this book produces just a little dribble of interest, and, maybe there's a couple of ideas that are interesting, and, okay, they get solved fairly quickly, then it's going to go back to, the dust pile. On the other hand, there are opening lines that stay fashionable forever. Okay, so bishop to b5, a6. Okay, so we can go into the main line here. Or let's take an absolute main line, we might say, like the Marshall. All right, so this position, I mean, there are all kinds of sublines, and I mean, it gets explored to move 25, move 30, and it's just, gets investigated more and more deeply. So right now, this is a main line, as it were, one of the trendiest variations. But it hasn't always been so. So there have been times where it was thought that, okay, White has a definite edge, Black can grovel for a draw, but, it's unpleasant. And so, okay, it's there, it's not refuted, it can be played, but it's just not that interesting because it seemed at one point as if White had fairly standard, clear ways to have some advantage. And, the cost-benefit analysis for Black really wasn't such a great payoff. But since then, it's much less clear. So anyway, that's how it works. It's whatever is hot. You could call a main line. But main lines, generally speaking, are opening variations where there are a lot of problems to be solved. It's a rich position. There's no simple solution. And and because of that, it's popular, and players of all, let's say, rating levels like to try it out. Whereas a sideline, again, what makes a sideline is that whatever problems it generates are or have been fairly easily solved. So it's not that the Ponziani loses, by no means. But I think black equalizes without much difficulty. And, black doesn't have to memorize an awful lot. And the positions aren't especially complex and don't require a great deal of technical expertise. So that's why it's a sideline. The poison pawn. Okay, that's gone off and on, but it's a main line in the sense that it's also a very formidable approach for black. So there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, it's white who generally avoids the poison pawn, or at least did for many, many years. It wasn't black who avoided it, but white. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close here, and I hope that's at least somewhat illuminating. If not, I apologize. Maybe you can reframe the question, and I can come back to it another time. All right, so thanks a lot, everybody. See you next time. Bye-bye.